So, Erik, today's episode is totally one of those small world stories. As you know, until about 3 years ago, I lived in the Bay Area in California.
Yep.
And it turned out that at some point, I learned that our high school friend, Erik, guy who we were in a ska band with, obviously a very talented individual to pal up with us, but turned out not only did he live within a couple miles of me, but he was on a fire path. And that was just such a fun realization. And so here he is today, our other friend, Erik, to talk with us about his path. So maybe we just jump right in and just say, Erik, number 2, what's your fire status? Where are you at these days?
Yeah, well, 1, thank you so much for having me. 2, I love your show, right? I don't listen to or consume a lot of fire resources, and 2 sides of fire is, and it's especially because, and we'll probably talk about this, the 2 of you focus a lot on non-financial aspects of fire, and that's usually where I'm seeking. So I am newly retired, right? So let me
Congrats, man. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So let me just give a quick overview of myself. So obviously I am from this, more or less from the same hometown. We went to high school together.
Right.
We were in a band together. I have left upstate New York. I went to California for college, and I basically stayed in California for the rest of my life. I have been working in big tech for probably the last 15 plus years, mostly in product management. I'm married. My wife is a physician, and we have 2 kids. And this is probably a little different than most people my age, which is I have a 5-year-old and I have a 1-year-old. So I'm 49 years old. I've got a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. So my portfolio might be a little higher for someone my age, but it's just because I have a lot of deferred expenses, right? I am still paying for daycare and preschool and all the likes that the 2 of you have probably already paid for. My wife and I are probably what I would refer to collectively as coastFIRE. I am retired. My wife is continuing to work. We'll probably dive a little bit into the numbers and at least of what we're willing to share. We are not, in terms of what our number is, our annual spend is more than 4% of what our portfolio is, right? So we can easily support me not working. My wife has actually we recently moved to Sacramento from the Bay Area. And in doing so, my wife has ratcheted back her work. She works 25% less than she did in the Bay Area. So we're both coastFIRE-ish. She's still working, will continue to do so, and I am a retired stay-at-home dad.
Nice. So give me a little bit about the timeline here, Erik. So when you say newly retired, are we talking like 10 days, 15 days?
Yeah, so it's like 2 months, two months, 2 weeks.
Wow. Okay. So you're in you're in the honeymoon phase right now.
I am, and it probably came a little bit sooner than I had planned. So Jason knows this, right? So he's one of the few people that I've been talking with about this whole, fire. And my wife and I have been talking about it for years, and we basically had this, it started with, when I turn 50, I'm going to retire. Right. Mm-hmm. And we've been working towards that for a few years, and we were, in agreement and alignment. Like we knew we were going to move to Sacramento. We were, planning our second kid, having our second kid. So this was all things that we had planned out and we're working towards. And, hey, when I 50-ish plus minus, right, like that was when I was going to retire. Anyway, as we got, we moved to Sacramento, we had our second kid, things started becoming crystallized a bit more. April 2023 was our target date, right? So, there was a vesting date at work. And so it was sort of like, hey, let's hit that vest date. And then, hey, I think I'm going to pull the cord and retire. And then I was texting Jason back and forth about this. I'm like, hey, I think this was back in November or December. Like, hey, I think I'm going to do it. I think I'm finally going to do it. I'm going to do it in April.
The countdown.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So it ended up happening a little sooner than planned because my company had a huge round of layoffs, of which I was a part of back in February. Wow. And thankfully, right, like I was planning on retiring, and it actually worked out great because they accelerated my vesting, which was I was holding on to April 4. So I got that. They gave me a very generous severance package. And so, I wasn't quite, mentally prepared for, hey, let's retire. Hey, let's have a party. it was sort of like, oh, I'm retired now. But thankfully, we've been working towards it financially. We're in a position to do it, and it happened a couple months later. But I got I've effectively earned a few more months of salary out of it.
So, I mean, it's not often we get the chance to see somebody who's newly retired, like in that honeymoon phase. Is it as grand as what I'm anticipating? Like, is it that good?
Well, yes, and right. Because it wasn't something that I was exactly prepared for. In my mind, April was the date I had to get to.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought hey, I'll probably want to work a few more months, maybe want to, finish out the year, tie up some loose ends with work, finish up some projects, like ride off into the sunset, have a retirement party.
Go watch. Yeah.
So I didn't have this, huge buildup, right? It was abrupt. And then so the first couple of weeks was just like, oh, hey, wait, I'm not unemployed. I'm not looking for the next job. I'm now retired. So, it's only been 2.5 months,
Right.
First couple of weeks was just like coming to terms with it. But over the last couple of months, like it's been good. I've always worried about am I going to have enough to do in retirement? Right. Like, do I need something to retire to? And right now, being a stay-at-home dad with a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old has more than taken up my time. And the other thing is we bought a home, which was the first time I've ever owned a house. And we bought a very nice house, right? Big yard, pool, right, et cetera. There's a lot of work and maintenance that goes around with owning a home. And I realize, a lot of your audience probably already knows that. The two of you already know that. You've been homeowners before and have been for a while. For me, it's just like I just, swapped out a thermistor for my pool sensor this morning, right? Like I've never had to do that before, but
it's kind of a weird confluence of you're doing all these things at once. You have another young kid, right? Second young child, which adds to the work exponentially. I know, having 2 kids, you're a new homeowner and you're newly retired. That's kind of a strange intersection of things. You must have an interesting friend group, I would guess.
Well, so yes, and right. So I moved to Sacramento. So my wife's from Sacramento, right? So that I didn't have necessarily a big built-in friend group here in Sacramento. Like I'm friends with her friends, and I have become good friends with a lot of her friends over the years. And I have one good friend from college who moved. Basically, very similar story. My wife and I met through them. He stopped working. He's a stay-at-home dad. He retired maybe 3-4 years ago. They moved from the Bay Area to Sacramento. So we're just sort of following in their footsteps. So I have a friend group, but for the most part, I'm still working on developing that network here locally.
I don't know all the details, but as I understand it, you've been on this path for a while. I think you're a self-professed boglehead. I'd be interested to hear, anything about how this idea originated. How did you know you were targeting early retirement? And then what kind of steps did you and Deb take to ensure that this path was a viable one for you?
Yeah, it probably started the other way around, right? After Deb and I met and gotten, I think this was either after we got engaged or right after we got married, we started merging our finances together. Right now, we're both very financially compatible. Right, we made similar salaries. We were lucky to have high incomes, and we're both pretty frugal. Right, we were not big spenders, but she had a financial advisor who managed her finances when we got married, and I did not. But I'm still getting up to speed in terms of merging accounts. And, in the back of my head, I'm like, I've never been pro financial advisor, but, hey, she already has one. She's comfortable with them. If you I knew enough if you had really good ones that they can be worth, what you pay for them. Mm-hmm. But as I started digging in more, my wife had a couple of whole life insurance policies. I'm like, whole life insurance? And I'm just like, that doesn't make sense. And they were sold to her by her financial advisor. So they were both insurance salespeople and financial advisors. And I started digging in, and I didn't really know all the ins and outs. And there's a lot, it's obviously intentional. There's a lot of misinformation out there around all the pro benefits of using whole life insurance and variable life insurance as an investment vehicle, right? And so my head was swimming because they would spout all of this off and oh no, for tax reasons this. And I started doing more and more research, and that's how I found my first resource was the white coat investor, right? Because there was a
one.
article on how to ditch your whole life insurance, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. And that's when I discovered Bogleheads, right? And so anyway, long story short, we got out of divorced ourselves from that financial advisor, merged our accounts, and from the beginning, like, I became a diehard Boglehead, right? And I subscribed to all its philosophies. I got out of owning individual stocks, focused on, low cost, being diversified. And so we've done that since we've been married.
This is how many years ago? So, this is like 15, 20 years
10
ago?
years, 10? A decade.
Okay.
A decade.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, we've been lucky to have been invested wisely, being well diversified. It also helps over the last 10 years. There's been quite a, being a bull market to run. And we were also like big savers, right? And that's how I learned about backdoor Roths and mega backdoor Roths. And my wife had that available at her work and I did not. And I was, it was another person and I, we became advocates to get backdoor Roths available at, our company. Yeah. Right. And so we were doing all of this, tax sheltered savings and super savings. And I think it was at that point, it wasn't the goal of, hey, let's retire early. It was, let's just do a good job of saving, make sure like we're financially in a good position.
Right.
Fast forward 5, 6, 7 years later, we're doing a great job of saving. The market is going up. All of a sudden, our portfolio is much, much bigger than when we started with. And that was when we started saying, hey, you know what? Maybe when we're like 55, 55, 56, 57, we could think of, retiring early. And that's sort of what started the whole process, right?
Got it.
And then I discovered the FIRE movement, continued savings, continued market appreciation. That number started shrinking, having further and further discussions with my wife. She was on board, at least with me retiring, if not her retiring, because I tried to sell her and moving to a lower cost area. I'm like, hey, we could retire today and go to Portugal. Let's go.
Right.
For family, I kind of said that jokingly, but, obviously for cultural reasons and family reasons, we're going to remain here in California. That's part of the reason why we moved to Sacramento. So we're not going anywhere. But anyway, that's sort of how we came into it. And so it was a combination of, being lucky, right? We worked for, we both had high paying positions. We were able to save a lot, but also like being smart about it. Like, hey, how do you invest? How do you do low cost? How do you live below your means? How do you save more? And then, I started locking in on the FIRE community and seeing like, okay, like we're doing all the right things. We just got to keep doing it. And now a few years later, I'm retired.
So I see where the vision for FIRE came from. But there was some crystallizing moment where you guys had this conversation between you and Deb, your wife, and said, there's a conscious decision made for you to retire and for her to keep working. I'm really interested in that.
Yeah. So the big part of this is my wife has a defined, she has a pension that comes with additional benefits. And the way it works for her is it's highly incentivized to last till age 60, right? So she works in the emergency department, right? And so there's a high rate of burnout. It's a tough job. And so what her employer does is, there's a pension, right? And the longer you work, the more you earn, all good. But there is this huge quantum step up if she works till at least age 60, meaning if she works till she's 59 and 364 days, she'll continue to accrue like additional benefits and her pension will be higher. If she makes it till age 60, there is this ratchet up in terms of benefits. And so she feels, and I'm not, we financially we're in a position where we don't need her to work until she's 60, assuming no market crash or anything of the like. But she feels like, hey, I'd be leaving too much on the table not to work till I'm 60. It's too good of a deal. Basically, I told her, I'm like, listen, like if you don't like your job, get out now, right? You can go do something else, right? But whatever you do, don't stay at this job at age 58 and decide you don't want to be there anymore, right?
Right.
Because if you get there at 58, I'm going to make you stay until you're 60. Get out now.
Yeah.
Get out now or last till you're 60.
Okay.
But you guys had a conversation in there like, okay, so how come you're retired? I mean, I understand there's a circumstance that happened at your place of employment or previous place of employment, but like there must have been a discussion.
We had that plan. Yeah, no, we had that plan well in advance. I think part of it is, I think it's exactly that. Like, the more we both work, the more we earn. Great, the more we save. But for her, right, she feels like this financial, she'd be leaving way too much behind if she retired and if I kept working. Right. Like I just continue to earn salary and whatever, stock, whatever, and I can save more and we can earn it that way. She sees this as, hey, if I make it to 60, like I get like this, very good retirement package. And so she's like, I'm going to work till 60. I don't feel the need for both of us to work to 60, right? Because the other thing is she works days, nights, weekends, holidays. So that puts me in daddy daycare a lot of the time, right? So, yeah, right. So I think she feels a little guilt, like, hey, this is great. Like, Erik, you can, you're going to have to take care of the kids when I'm working on these times that you're not working. And so I think she also feels that if I retire, it's easier for me to help out with kids in those times when she Saturday night, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, whatever, she's working.
So I have a specific question about a couple things you've said. So, you've described your path sort of as, basically coastFIRE. You can get to this target and Deb will work until 60. But also, you made the comment a minute ago, as long as the market doesn't crash. I'm wondering, do you have specific plans in place to not only make it to that end point that you want to reach it at her achieving 60, but, from a portfolio perspective, in whatever way you want to define it, have you taken means to make sure that if her decision does change, you guys are still financially in a good place?
Yeah. So let me, be clear, which is we could both retire today. We cannot live the lifestyle that we have, meaning we couldn't afford the house we bought as it stands right now with a 4% withdrawal rate on our portfolio. Now, when I just do back of the envelope numbers, I know I've watched your episodes on safe withdrawal rates and the toolbox, and like my head hurts, and I'm just like, enough is enough. Cut that stuff out, right? Get to the interesting stuff, man. Right? Tell me, I want to hear about Duran Duran, right? I want to hear about Erik going to some metal concert. So we're in that position, right? Neither of us would have made this position if we didn't have some like a way to be like, okay, what would happen if, like, we both lost our jobs, some of us were incapacitated, we had health problems, etc. Like we've taken all of those considerations into account, right? I mean, I think the one thing we would probably have to do is either I would go back to work or we would downsize on the house if anything happened. Like I said, like we could have moved to Portugal years ago and both been retired and lived La Vida Loca there, right? I guess that's Spanish, not Portuguese, but whatever.
Correct.
Right. So, yeah. And the other thing, when I said like barring a market crash, I don't mean like a standard market crash. I mean, if it crashed 80, 90%, then all of a sudden, like, something's different. Now, with that being said, right, I'm very diversified. Not everything is in the market, right? I feel like we have a very, if not conservative, like we're like 70-30 plus minus 70% equity, 30% fixed income, right?
Okay,
plus
so
minus.
same as me. Yep.
Yeah.
So
I feel like we're in a good position.
Was there I kind of want to dive back into this conversation between you and your wife, because it's unusual that one spouse gives permission to the other to retire, but also being in your position, being the one retired, you're assuming a set of household responsibilities that you haven't had before, but you're also in a way delaying a standard retirement, because that might not be the retirement that I would picture for myself and my wife, because your wife is naturally working a ton of hours to make her job happen. So has there been any, like, what was that discussion? Did you just hate working, or what was it what was that inciting event?
No, I definitely didn't hate working, right? I mean, I think this was one of the challenges that I was worried about with retirement, which is I derived a lot of my sense of worth from work, right? I mean, and have been for first it was college and education, and then it was work. So that has certainly been a big part of my life, and I was worried about that. I think it was, I was the culture at my company had changed. Like we were a tech startup. We went public. And then we were acquired by a private equity firm, and that very much changed the culture. And a lot of old people left, like the people I would say I grew up with at the company, right? And it was just different, right? And it wasn't necessarily a great fit for me, but I had in this mind like, I'm gonna work till 50. So that it wasn't about me hating work. I think it was, I think a big part of it was my wife feels this obligation to work till 60 because of the additional accrual of benefits and this ratchet up in pension, and she knows financially like we both don't need to do it. And I think I wouldn't say guilt, but I know she's always mentioned like, hey, on my days off, like let's say I have Tuesday, Wednesday off this week, those are my 2 days off. I have downtime because the kids are in school or in preschool and daycare. Right. And if your day's off Saturday and Sunday and I'm working, well, you've got the kids because they're not. And so I think there was this notion of like, hey, you might not be getting as much time off when you're working.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that factored in a little bit into the equation. And, I alluded to, we have friends, another couple here in the Sacramento area that we're good friends with, that they sort of set the standard. Like he retired to be a stay-at-home dad. Right. And she kept working. I think their circumstances were a little different. I think, I don't think they looked at it as FIRE per se. I think it was more, hey, we're moving to Sacramento, lower cost area. They've got more kids. There's certainly more demands in terms of household things. And she's at the same employer, right? She has the same, benefit package that, she makes it till 60. It becomes very worthwhile.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's really the blueprint. Yeah.
There's a little peer pressure there, right? Or not peer pressure, but like, yeah, we're following in their footsteps a little bit. And I think that also helped my wife to become, more comfortable with it.
It's interesting because Jason and I have had this conversation where he's kind of gone through these different phases, right? You go through the honeymoon phase and then you get to this phase where you're like, what am I actually going to do with all this time? And, and so I've watched him go through that and I'll probably watch you go through that in the same way. And it's just, I think it's curious for someone who has been working at a really high stress job when you immediately just cut the cord,
right?
And you're left in free fall and you're surrounded by your kids and your family who you love, and you got this new house and all these things. Like, what does that feel like? What does it, is it like, is it almost terrifying in a way? Cause that's kind of how I picture it.
It's not terrifying, at least not yet. Right. One, it takes me a little while to come to terms with my emotions. Right. I'm not the most I'm very emotionally guarded. So I think there's probably still I haven't fully accepted everything or what it all means. So I think there's probably still another few more months in my runway there to get to that, to really understand hey, what does this mean? Like, what am I, is there anything that I'm scared about here in retirement? Like my, other things like that. So I'm probably not there yet.
Okay.
But I do I don't have that much of a schedule yet. Basically it's the two things, and this is going to go away. Right. But, long story, we didn't know where we were going to live, and we had to find daycares and preschools before we actually bought a house. So our kids go to school a half an hour away from where we live. So that means it's 30 minutes and then 30 minutes, an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening.
Wow.
And, my wife and I would just, when I was working, would sort of trade off on that. Like, okay, you do drop off, I'll do pickup. Now my wife still does some of it, but I do more of it. But come, in August, my son will start kindergarten, and that'll be, 10, 12 blocks away from where we live. My daughter is going to switch daycare providers, which is going to be, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 blocks from where we live. So that'll go away. And then I'm going to have more time to fill into my schedule.
Yeah.
So I've been, I've had a lot of little things to keep me busy. The kids' commute keeps me busy. There's been a ton of little repairs that have been needed to be done around the house. And I just had this laundry list. Like when I was working, I'm like, I'll get to it. Now I've gotten to it. And I'm kind of checked all of those off. And I have a feeling like I'm going to have this, for lack of a better term, coming to Jesus moment of being retired. And I'm like, and now what? These boxes are checked. Yeah. The kids are at school. I'm going to need something else to do with my time. but
Yes.
I just haven't gotten there yet.
How much thought did you put into that idea of what am I retiring to, other than the things you've stated already, which is, more time with your family, compatible time off with your wife's schedule? What did you, why was this the right path to create this space for yourself to operate in? And what did you foresee that, filling that time with?
Yeah, great question. And probably it wasn't until maybe the last year I even really thought about that. Because again, it was just sort of like, oh, it's in the future. It's in the future, right? Like, I'll figure it out. Yeah, I know it's important, but hey, smart guy, I'll figure it out. And it was really, listening to Two Sides of FI, again, it's like, I don't know if I mentioned this, like, since we've been recording, maybe we said this, earlier, like, I don't consume a lot of FIRE resources outside of Two Sides of FI. And the reason for that is I feel very, very comfortable with finances, right? I know how to handle taxes. I know how to invest. I know, I live and breathe by the Boglehead principles and have for a decade or more now. But what I don't know is exactly all those things you brought up and things that you have brought up in other episodes earlier on about having something to retire to, or, what are you going to do with your day? And the phases of retirement, the honeymoon, the sort of the acceptance, and sort of you go into all these phases. So thankfully to both of you in this show, like I know these are things I've needed to do. And so I thought about it. And in the back of my head, I just took the easy way out. I'm like, I don't want to golf. I don't want to sail. I don't want to. And it was like in the back of my head, it was always just like, I will volunteer and go do something that I'm passionate about, right? And I have looked at volunteering with a couple of different food banks here in Sacramento. I haven't done it yet, but I at least know like where they are, what they're looking for in terms of volunteering. That I'm, my goals are things that I would be looking to support are compatible with theirs and vice versa. So I do feel there's like I said, in 2, 3, 4 months when my kids switch schools and all of a sudden I get even more free time, in the day and more of these little boxes checked, there is going to be, well, what's next, right? And I think it probably will be volunteering. I can't sit around. I'll go crazy just sitting home around
it gets
home
old
all day. It gets old really fast, right? And I don't think I have much interest in going back to work in tech. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to hear about that a little bit because one of the things I was wondering about your wife's decision to continue working, aside from the golden handcuffs, is training to be an emergency room physician is many years and, a lot of skill building, and to walk away from that I can imagine that would feel difficult. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe that's a big component of it. Like she likes helping people and it's just kind of a natural progression for her, an extension of who she is. What part of you and your job is missing now? I mean, did you work in tech? Was that a natural fit for you, or was it just like, oh, I'll go here because it's a highly compensated position and it seems to pique some of my interest?
No, I think it was a good fit, right? Like I think at the beginning of the show I mentioned, for the last 10, 15 years, I've been working in software product management. But before that, I moved to I moved to San Francisco in 2000 during the .com boom. Right? And I was hooked. Right? I loved working in tech. I was an engineer back then. And, at the time, and maybe not to the extent that it was then, but still very much Silicon Valley was the epicenter of like new tech. Like this is like where new, big, exciting things were happening.
So you were into that part of it. Yeah.
Oh, early on I was very, very much so. Right. Over the years, like I think the other part of it is it's a young person's game. Like as you get older, like it's not the same as you climb the career ladder. You're more involved in sort of like management and managing teams and not necessarily involved in the actual like technology or the product. And that's great in terms of building your career, building your skill sets. But it also removes you and you divorce a little bit from that. I spent the last 8, 9 years working for a company that did enterprise software. right? So you think of like tech and you think of like, oh, Amazon and Facebook and like all these, things that like, your grandmothers use and like people know it. I worked on software that, businesses bought and that the two of you would have never heard of. And again, so it was cool at first, right? It was great that it was a startup. There were a lot of smart people there, but you become even more divorced from the technology from that standpoint because it's not as cool or hot or as exciting. Like it was a great place to be financially. It was very rewarding, but it wasn't rewarding in the sense of like, oh, hey, like we're working on blockchains and we're working on whatever, like, generative AI. Like it wasn't that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Erik, because I think about this for myself as I look to land the plane, like transition into retirement. And I think, what am I losing with my job? And I think, as we get to, we're the same age, right? And we get to a certain point in your career, it almost becomes easy, right? It kind of loses its shine a little bit. I mean, how many different kitchens can I design for somebody as an architect? Like, it's like, I don't need to pick out another refrigerator. It's like not as fun as it used to be. And so I keep looking for those threads which, pull me forward and keep me interested. And I mean, you mentioned generative AI, and that's like completely changing the architecture space right now. And that's something that I'm following. And I don't imagine that going away when I step into retirement, but it sounds like for you, there's been kind of like a hard stop on some of that. And I wonder, like, what takes its place? Like, what's that new thing? Like, is that kind of what you're struggling with?
Yeah, a little bit. Like I said, like I don't know what that new thing is, right? Like right now, it's been this laundry list, punch card list of all the little things that need to get fixed around the house. It's schlepping my kids back and forth to daycare, preschool, getting my son lined up for summer camps and all of that. But I think eventually, like, all those little things go away. And I think I've been intentionally filling my days with all these little things because there is a void. And I don't know what that is. And that's why, for me, I joke, I'm like, oh, I'll just volunteer. I should be a little, I've given a lot more thought about that. It's not just volunteer. It's whether I do something for free or not. I want to do something. I don't want to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Right. And I do want to do something that I'm passionate about. Right. Exactly. Where I feel like, I like to think I'm giving back to the community somehow, some way. It doesn't mean, I don't think I need to be curing cancer or anything like that. But like I said, like I very likely will get involved with one of the food banks here in Sacramento, unless maybe I can find something else. I just haven't stumbled upon it, but I will likely do something like that with where it takes like 15, 20 hours of my time. Mm-hmm. And I'm using that as a proxy. Like it could very well be, other things that I care about. One of the other things I've looked at volunteering is there are programs set up to help people with their taxes, right? I alluded, like, I'm pretty comfortable with the tax code and,
Jason's doing that
being
right
able.
now.
Yeah. That's
right. Yeah. Are you?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I was a VITA volunteer this tax season. So that just tells me which episodes you haven't watched.
Yeah, you're skipping those episodes, man. We know
Don't
you.
skip those.
You're seen.
No, I feel like I've seen every episode, so I feel like maybe you were the inspiration for me to look into that.
Yeah, maybe.
And I don't remember crediting you to that idea.
I'm not looking for a payout. I just want to make sure you're watching a show to the end, because sometimes we disclose some pretty amazing things at the end of the show, as a couple of commenters recently pointed out.
Don't disclose things at the very end.
Okay, so you watch the end of that one. All right. You mentioned earlier that I was one of the few people maybe that you talked to about this kind of path that you were on. So I'm interested in, were there other people you disclosed this intention to retire early, other than your wife? Obviously, this was a plan you made together. And then secondly, since you've now stopped working, what do you tell people you do? And do you talk openly about FIRE? I'm very interested in both halves of that.
Yeah. So the answer is, outside of my wife, up until a year ago, I really didn't talk about it with anyone. There was 2 or 3 people at work who I talked about it, and then over the course of time, I became more and more comfortable. So I started talking about it more and more with friends. Not a lot, but I would say, like, I'm looking to retire in the next year or so. Right? It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to retire on this date. What do you think? So I became more and more comfortable with it. And I think that helped quite a bit because when I pulled the cord, it's like, okay, I'm retired. And people are like, I'm still new to the neighborhood. I'm still what do you do?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I was like, I'm retired. Right. I didn't think like, am I a stay-at-home dad? Am I in between jobs? Like, I'm just like, no, I embraced it from the get-go. I just said, I'm retired.
And how did that go? Did you get any must be nice, or like how has it been received?
Fine. Like I expected, maybe more like commentary or sort of like backhanded compliments. But no. I mean, awesome. For the most part, I think FIRE is, I think becoming a more understood, I wouldn't say it's not a phenomenon anymore. I think it's more understood lifestyle.
Yep.
I think that's part of it. And it's, like I said, there's so many flavors of it. And I would say collectively, my wife and I are coastFIRE. Right. So, it'd be one thing of like, hey, I'm sitting on the lawn and drinking a Mai Tai and I meet a new neighbor and I say, oh yeah, I'm retired. It's another thing like I'm at, gymnastics class with my kids and I meet a neighbor who I recognize on the, from living down the road. And they're like, we start a conversation and they're like, what do you do? I'm retired. The fact that I'm there watching like, two kids, like, during, class, I think I get a little more acceptance with that.
Sure. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. We haven't really talked about finances in a way, in a real granular way. You mentioned having your finances totally under control. Talk to me about that. How'd you set the number? How did you determine? I don't know if you're a budgeter or not. How do you determine the annual spend and the withdrawal rate? Because that's a big part of this transition point.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know if I mentioned this before. I would say like what our spend is and what our portfolio is. Like right now, it's more than 4%. Right. Okay. So we could not retire. Again, I'm not taking into account Social Security, my wife's pension, like all these other things where, hey, we have run the numbers. Like if we both retire, we can make this work. But I did a lot of this. Like, hey, can I take 4%? Can we live off of 4% of what our portfolio is? And it's not. I'm not a budgeter. I think I'm probably more like Erik and less like Jason in this sense, which is
it's okay.
I don't budget a lot. Like, oh, when am I spending this month? Am I spending more on this? But we've always lived very. We made a good income collectively. We were very frugal in how we chose to spend our money, right? And we always paid ourselves first, right? For lack of a better expression, right? So we were always maxing out our 401ks. We were doing the backdoor Roth IRAs. We're doing the mega backdoor Roth IRAs. We were funding 529 accounts. We were funding our brokerage, our taxable brokerage accounts, right? So, we were, pay our bills first and then like do the savings, and then everything left over was what we paid for. So that was sort of how we did it. I mean, we were saving, right? So we knew we were living. So I didn't budget in that sense. But what I have done and have done for years is I first started using Quicken years ago, and then moved over to Mint.
Yep.
And it's mostly like for expense tracking, just to keep track of like, hey, like every now and then there's an expense that pops up like, hey, I don't recognize this. Did my wife buy something? Was there, a mischarge or whatever? And just to keep an eye on it in that way. And what's great is, at the end of the year or whenever I want to, I can go in and say, okay, give me everything that I've spent in the last year and total up. And that's what I do. Now I realize that's a very inexact science, because it'll record what I pay in taxes to the IRS, but it doesn't record what I pay in taxes that come out of my paycheck.
Sure.
Right.
So I'm like, oh, I pay this extra in taxes, right? So there are, a couple of loan payments that come directly out of my wife's paycheck that just don't show up. Like it's lower income and it doesn't show up as an expense line. I'm like, all right. So, that's what I do in terms of budgeting. Right? Okay. Now, with that being said, and so I can go back 12 months take that and say, okay, is that, more than 4% of my portfolio? Well, the answer is yes. The other, a couple challenges I have, and I think this is going to resonate with, anyone. It doesn't matter where you are in life. If you're a parent, you know that daycare, preschool is expensive, right? And so we pay, after tax, we're paying about $45,000 a year in childcare, right, for 2 kids. Now, the great news, my son's about to go to kindergarten.
You get a raise,
go to public school. He's going to at least start in the public school, and hopefully we like it and he stays there. And so all of a sudden that's going to drop, right? In a few years, my daughter will do the same, and that's going to drop.
Yeah. And other things will take its place. Yeah.
Well, that too. But my point being is, like, I go back and I look at every year for the last 2-3 years has been anomalous, right? And I'm like, this is not what my steady state spending is, because, we bought a house, we bought furniture, we bought this, right? So we had these one-time expenses. It's like, we had a second kid. So there are all these startup costs with having a second kid, right? And it's like, now we're paying twice in preschool daycare, but my son's about to age out of that. So I don't know, I know exactly what my annual spend was last year, right? I don't know. I've gone through and done a budget and said, okay, that's probably going to come down by about $40,000-$50,000, this coming year. And so then if I do that, then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? Maybe that is about a 4% with, not quite, but almost there.
But also you have this kind of buffer of having your wife continue to work. So that's the thing that kind of relieves the pressure to be so tight with the budget and the figures and, really getting in there and YNAB like Jason does. And, I feel there's a lot of freedom in that. And it's not everyone has that option, but that's right. Nice to hear it explained.
Yeah. So, I remember once my wife's like, oh, well, and this, she said, kind of jokingly, but she said this 2-3 years ago. She's like, when you retire, hey, if we need to cut expenses, we can just we can cut cable or whatever. And I was just like, we need another financial meeting.
Yeah.
We're gonna put it just descending amounts of where we spend
fixed
our
cost.
money.
Yeah,
right.
Craft beer's got to go first, man. It's definitely going to be more than the cable bill.
Well, I was going to say,
I met your wife.
She's saying that she's a physician, right? I'm like, hey, I love the willingness to be frugal and cut corners. Hey, that's going to be the last, not in terms of priority, but it'll be the last thing in terms of the amount that it's going to move the needle.
Well, I was going to say, you got to cut daycare, man. Keep the kids home.
Exactly. That'd be the first thing. We take out daycare, and all of a sudden, you know what? This budget works, right?
Yeah, I think we should do a check-in with you. I don't know, 6 months, 8 months, something like that, and see where you're at and see how things have changed, because you're going to go through this big transition period, and it'll be fascinating.
I would love to. And what I'm really hoping by, that point is I have come to terms with all of that. I don't think I'm going to figure everything out, but hopefully I will have a little bit more of a schedule. I'll have a little bit more purpose outside of my kids and family with this additional time that I have.
Yeah.
So that'd be great.
This should comfort you, not scare you. But to be quite honest, 3 years into it, I'm figuring it out every day. There's a lot of things I feel like I've worked through, I understand, and I feel really great about. But then there's things that are still unknown. And, retirees have told me, on average, they find 5 to 7 years before they really have moved into another phase of life, wholly, basically. So I try to use that as just kind of a guiding principle and not something to be afraid of. So, keep it in mind if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. Right. And I think that 5 to 7 years is probably doubly impactful timeline for me, because it's not just, hey, maybe it takes that much time for me to just sort of figure it out. I think it's also, I'm going to go through 2 or 3 more phases, not just as a retiree, but as a father.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
100%. I've got now a young toddler and a small boy, right? 5 years. Yeah. Right. That, I guess I'll have a small girl and a 10-year-old going on 20-year-old. Right. Yeah. But it changes. Right. So I think there's a lot for me to, go through with, parenthood and fatherhood. And my guess is probably the same thing, in being married, right? I think Deb and I probably have to evolve as parents, which probably means we have to evolve as partners as well. So,
Well, Erik, you've clearly given us a bunch of time today and just a lot of great information. It's so refreshing to see somebody's experience, right out of the gate, what you're going through. And we're just thankful for the degree of candor you've given us. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, and I want to jump in here and say thank you, Erik. I'm in admiration of you kind of making this transition. A lot of people plan, financially. A lot of people plan mentally, and a lot of people don't actually make it to where you're sitting right now.
It's
and
true.
To be able to get to where you are, but then also, be able to share that in a really cohesive story is really interesting to me. And I really look forward to kind of checking back in with you in, 8 or 9 months time when we get to see how it's developed, because right now it's so new for you. So congrats on the retirement, and thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Like I said, love the show. More trawlers, less toolboxes.
So now's the point of the show where Erik is going to reveal their PHI number. You've stayed tuned to the end, so you get the nugget here. Erik, what's your PHI number?
My number is